At 2100 hours on the night of September 13, 1942, the jungle south of Henderson Field fell silent. The birds stopped calling. The insects went quiet. Even the mosquitoes, those billions of tiny tormentors that had plagued the Marines day and night since they had landed on this wretched island, seemed to pause. For a few terrible seconds, the only sound on the southern coast of Guadalcanal was the breathing of 800 exhausted United States Marines, crouched in shallow foxholes along a narrow coral ridge, staring into absolute darkness. Then the sky split open. 7 Japanese destroyers offshore opened fire simultaneously. Shells screamed overhead and detonated across the ridge in blinding flashes of orange and white. The ground heaved beneath the Marines like a living thing. Trees snapped like matchsticks, hurling splinters in every direction. Shrapnel whined through the humid air, slicing through leaves, through sandbags, through flesh. The concussion waves slammed against eardrums and rattled teeth. Men pressed themselves into the coral, trying to make themselves as small as possible, trying to disappear into the earth itself. And before the last shells had landed, a sound rose from the jungle to the south that no man who heard it would ever forget. Thousands of voices, screaming in unison, rising from the darkness like a wave. The words they screamed were simple: "Marine, you die." What followed was one of the most desperate battles of the entire Pacific War. On that ridge, a Marine colonel named Merritt Edson, a man they called Red Mike, held the line with a handful of Raiders and Paramarines against a Japanese force that outnumbered them nearly 4-1. If his line broke, Henderson Field would fall. If Henderson Field fell, Guadalcanal was lost. And if Guadalcanal was lost, the entire Allied counteroffensive in the Pacific would be strangled in its cradle. Everyone above Edson in the chain of command was talking about withdrawal. Admirals in distant headquarters were debating whether the island could be held at all. Edson refused to listen. He refused to retreat. He refused to die. This is the story of how one man's refusal to quit saved an island, a campaign, and perhaps the war itself. Colonel Merritt Austin Edson was born on April 25, 1897, in Rutland, Vermont, a small New England city nestled in the Green Mountains. He grew up in the nearby town of Chester, where winters were long and bitterly cold, and where self-reliance was not a virtue but a basic condition of survival. Young Merritt was quiet, intense, and physically tough, traits that would define him for the rest of his life. He attended the University of Vermont for 2 years before the world changed forever. When America entered the First World War, Edson enlisted and received his commission as a second lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps on October 9, 1917. He sailed for France in late 1918, but a bout of mumps hospitalized him at Brest, and the armistice was signed before he could reach the front lines. That missed opportunity ate at him. Edson was a man who believed that a Marine's purpose was to close with the enemy and destroy him, and he had been denied that chance by a childhood disease. He spent the next 2 decades preparing himself and his men for the moment when fighting would come, with an intensity that sometimes alarmed even his fellow officers. He earned his naval aviator wings at Pensacola in 1922 and served at Guam, but his flying career ended in 1926 when a medical board found he had defective depth perception. It was a disappointment, but it redirected him toward the ground, toward the jungle, toward the kind of warfare that would ultimately forge his legend. In 1928, Captain Edson was sent to Nicaragua. The Marine Corps was fighting a grinding guerrilla war against the forces of Augusto Sandino in the mountainous jungle interior of the country, some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. Edson was given command of a detachment of about 60 hand-picked Marines, along with Mosquito Indian boatmen and guides, and he was ordered to pursue Sandino's fighters up the Coco River, deep into country that was unmapped and largely unexplored by outsiders. The patrol lasted weeks. They hacked through walls of vegetation with machetes. They forded flooded rivers chest-deep in brown water. They fought ambushes in terrain where visibility was measured in feet, not yards. They went days without resupply. Edson thrived. He was calm, under fire to the point of recklessness, soft-spoken in a way that made men lean in close to hear his orders, and absolutely relentless in pursuit. He earned his first Navy Cross for an action on August 7, 1928, during a fierce engagement on the route to Pateca. He also received the Nicaraguan Medal of Merit with Silver Star. It was in Nicaragua that the legend of Red Mike was born. He grew a thick red beard during the long patrol, because there was simply no time or clean water for shaving, and the nickname stuck for the rest of his life. Red Mike was also his radio call sign during the fighting on Guadalcanal, a deliberate echo of those Nicaraguan days. More importantly, he learned lessons in the Coco River country that no classroom could teach and no textbook could convey. Small unit jungle tactics, where the patrol leader must think like a hunter and move like a predator. How to read terrain by instinct when the maps were blank or wrong. How to keep exhausted, sick, frightened men moving forward through impossible conditions when every fiber of their bodies wanted to stop. How to fight an enemy who knew the ground better than you did and could disappear into the landscape like ghosts. The psychology of close combat in thick vegetation, where the enemy might be 10 feet away and completely invisible, where a firefight could erupt and end in 30 seconds, where the difference between life and death was reaction time measured in fractions of a heartbeat. These lessons, hammered into Edson's bones in the Nicaraguan jungle, would save Guadalcanal 14 years later. After Nicaragua, Edson returned to the States and served as a tactics instructor at the Marine Corps Basic School in Philadelphia, where he pounded his jungle warfare doctrine into a generation of young Marine officers. He helped draft the initial version of the Corps' Small Wars Manual alongside Major Harold Utley, producing the foundational text for counterinsurgency and irregular warfare operations. He later served with the 4th Marines in Shanghai, China, where he had the opportunity to observe Japanese military tactics and doctrine firsthand, studying with careful attention the army he would one day fight. In June 1941, with war clearly approaching, Edson took command of the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines at Quantico, Virginia. That unit was redesignated the 1st Separate Battalion in January 1942, and then, in February of that year, it received its final and most famous name, the 1st Marine Raider Battalion. Edson's Raiders. The name would become legendary, but first the men had to be forged. Edson drove his raiders through training that bordered on the inhuman. 25-mile forced marches completed in 5 hours, followed immediately by live-fire exercises. A full 30-mile march from Quantico to Manassas, with full packs, completed in 1 day. Hand-to-hand combat drills, knife fighting, demolitions, rubber boat landings, long-range patrolling, all repeated until the men could do them in their sleep. His raiders said later that they were more afraid of Red Mike Edson than they were of the Japanese. He wanted it exactly that way. He was not building soldiers. He was building men who would not break, no matter what happened around them. To understand what happened on that ridge in September 1942, you must first understand why the Marines were on Guadalcanal at all, and why they were so desperately alone when the crisis came. The Pacific War in the summer of 1942 was balanced on a knife's edge. The Battle of Midway, fought from June 4 through 7, had been a stunning American victory. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu, had been fatally crippled by American dive bombers. 3 were struck within minutes of each other on the morning of June 4. The 4th, the Hiryu, was hit that afternoon and scuttled the following day. All 4 were lost. Japan's offensive striking power was crippled. The strategic momentum in the Pacific had shifted, but Midway was a defensive victory. It stopped the Japanese advance. It did not push the Japanese back. For that, something else was needed. An offensive, a ground campaign, a place where American troops would go forward and take territory from the enemy for the first time. That place was Guadalcanal. Intelligence had revealed that the Japanese were constructing an airfield on this remote, jungle-covered island in the Solomon Islands chain, roughly 1,000 miles northeast of Australia. If that airfield was completed and became operational, Japanese bombers flying from it could threaten the vital sea lanes between the United States and Australia. Those sea lanes were the lifeline of the Allied war effort in the Pacific. If they were cut, Australia would be isolated. The island had to be taken. On August 7, 1942, just 2 months after Midway, 11,000 Marines of the 1st Marine Division, under Major General Alexander Archer Vandergrift, stormed ashore on Guadalcanal. 3,000 more Marines under Brigadier General William Rupertus landed simultaneously on the nearby islands of Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. The Guadalcanal landings caught the Japanese construction garrison by surprise, and the unfinished airfield was captured on August 8. 4 days later, on August 12, it was named Henderson Field, in honor of Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine dive bomber pilot, killed leading his squadron against the Japanese fleet at Midway. Edson's Raiders were part of the Tulagi assault force. The fighting on Tulagi was savage, close-quarters combat against Japanese defenders who fought to the death in caves, bunkers, and fortified positions. The Raiders suffered 22% casualties taking the island. It was their first taste of the kind of war the Japanese would wage across the Pacific, a war without surrender, without quarter, without mercy. But the triumph of the initial landings was brutally short-lived. The very next night, August 8–9, a Japanese cruiser force under Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa attacked the Allied Naval Task Force, guarding the transports in the waters off Guadalcanal. The Battle of Savo Island was the worst defeat in United States Navy surface history. 4 Allied heavy cruisers, the Quincy, the Vincennes, the Astoria, and the Australian Canberra, were sunk or fatally damaged in a devastating night action lasting barely half an hour. Over 1,000 Allied sailors died. In the aftermath of Savo Island, Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher withdrew his aircraft carriers from the area, and Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner had no choice but to pull the transport ships out before they too were sunk. The transports left before they had finished unloading. Nearly half the Marines' supplies, heavy equipment, ammunition, and food remained aboard ships that were now steaming away toward safer waters. The Marines on Guadalcanal were stranded, alone, undersupplied, and facing a Japanese military machine that was determined to retake the island at any cost. There would be no easy resupply. No reinforcements for weeks. The nearest friendly base was hundreds of miles away across waters controlled by the Japanese Navy. The Marines had what they had carried ashore and what they could capture from the enemy, and nothing more. The Marines called it Operation Shoestring, and they were not joking. They ate captured Japanese rice, often infested with maggots and weevils, sometimes rationed to as little as 2 tablespoons per meal. Coffee ran out within days. Cigarettes became currency. Men lost 20 to 40 pounds in the weeks that followed, their dungarees hanging off skeletal frames. Malaria swept through the ranks like a biblical plague. The Anopheles mosquito bred in the stagnant water that pooled everywhere in the tropical lowlands, and there was no escaping it. Dysentery from contaminated water, dengue fever, fungal infections, the men called jungle rot, scrub typhus, and hepatitis, all took their toll alongside the enemy. By the end of the campaign, malaria casualties on Guadalcanal would far outnumber combat casualties. The anti-malarial drug atabrine helped when men took it, but it turned their skin and the whites of their eyes a sickly yellow, and persistent rumors that it caused impotence meant many Marines refused to swallow the pills until officers stood over them and watched. During the day, the Marines controlled the skies immediately around Guadalcanal, a small, constantly dwindling collection of Marine Wildcat fighters and dauntless dive bombers at Henderson Field, collectively known as the Cactus Air Force, after the island's code name, kept Japanese shipping at bay and made daylight approaches dangerous for the enemy fleet. But at night, the situation reversed completely. Fast Japanese cruisers and destroyers controlled the surrounding waters. They raced down the channel between the islands that the Marines had begun calling Iron Bottom Sound, after the growing number of warships from both sides that littered its floor. These nightly runs, which the Americans called the Tokyo Express, shelled the marine perimeter, landed Japanese reinforcements and supplies, and disappeared north before dawn. Every night, the rumble of engines offshore, the sweep of searchlights across the water, and the shriek of incoming naval shells became the grim rhythm of life on Guadalcanal. By early September 1942, the situation was approaching a crisis at every level. On the island, the Marines were sick, hungry, and outnumbered by a Japanese garrison that was growing nightly thanks to the Tokyo Express. Above them, in the chain of command, Vice Admiral Robert Gormley, the overall Allied commander for the South Pacific area, headquartered far from the fighting in Noumea, New Caledonia. It was deeply pessimistic about holding Guadalcanal. Gormley had never visited the island. His staff openly discussed evacuation. In the days just before the decisive battle, Rear Admiral Turner arrived on Guadalcanal and personally relayed to General Vandergrift the grim reality of Gormley's thinking. The message was blunt. The Navy could no longer adequately support the Marines on Guadalcanal. Vandergrift was authorized to make whatever arrangements were necessary. The implication was unmistakable. Retreat was on the table. The men fighting and dying on that ridge might be abandoned. Vandergrift gathered his staff and told them plainly, "As long as I am here, there will be no surrender of this place. We will continue as we are." Gormley himself would be relieved of command on October 18, 1942, replaced by Vice Admiral William Bull Halsey, a far more aggressive commander. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who personally visited Guadalcanal on September 30, something Gormley never did, made the decision. He judged Gormley too pessimistic to win. That was the strategic backdrop. The Marines were clinging to a strip of jungle coastline around an airfield that was everything, defending it against an enemy that was reinforcing faster than they were, supported by a naval command structure that was seriously considering pulling the plug. Into this crisis stepped Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi. Kawaguchi had arrived on Guadalcanal with his reinforced 35th Infantry Brigade, an experienced formation that had seen successful action in Borneo, Cebu, and Mindanao. He was a veteran officer, born December 3, 1892, in Kochi Prefecture, a graduate of the Imperial Japanese Army Academy in 1914. His total force on Guadalcanal numbered approximately 6,000 men, drawn from the 124th Infantry Regiment under Colonel Akinosuke Oka, the Kuma Battalion, which consisted of survivors from Colonel Ichiki's 28th Regiment that had been destroyed at the Ilu River on August 21 in what became known as the Battle of the Tenaru, a name given by Marines who had misidentified the river on their maps, and the 2nd Battalion of the 4th Infantry Regiment. Kawaguchi divided his forces into 3 attack groups. The main striking force, roughly 3,000 men designated the center body, would attack the Marine perimeter from the south, through the jungle, aimed directly at Henderson Field. Colonel Oka's group of approximately 1,000 men would attack from the west, while the Kuma Battalion would hit from the east. It was an ambitious plan that required precise coordination through trackless jungle without reliable communications. On September 8, 8 days before the climactic battle, Edson received a critical piece of intelligence that would change everything. Working with information from Australian coast watcher Captain Martin Clemens and his network of loyal Solomon Islander scouts, Edson learned that a large Japanese supply base had been established at Taivu Point, about 20 miles east along the coast. Edson launched a daring raid. 813 raiders loaded onto 2 destroyer transports, the McKean and the Manly, plus 2 patrol boats, and landed at Taivu Point at 0520 on September 8. Hidden by a fortuitous rain squall, they pushed into the village of Tasimboko, scattered the Japanese rear guard, and overran Kawaguchi's main supply depot. The haul was enormous. Food, medical supplies, ammunition, radio equipment, 2 75mm field guns, and 2 37mm anti-tank guns. Everything the raiders could not carry, they destroyed. Casualties were remarkably light. 2 Marines killed, 6 wounded, 27 Japanese counted dead. But the most important prize from Tasimboko was not weapons or rice. It was paper. Captured documents confirmed that at least 3,000 Japanese troops were on the island and were planning a major overland attack from the south, aimed at recapturing Henderson Field from inland. Edson and Colonel Gerald Thomas, Vandergrift's sharp operations officer, studied aerial photographs of the terrain south of Henderson Field and identified a narrow coral ridge running roughly parallel to the Lunga River, about a mile south of the airfield. The ridge was approximately 1,000 meters long, a spine of hard coral covered in coarse kunai grass, rising above the surrounding jungle. It consisted of 3 hillocks, Hill 80 at the southern end, roughly 80 feet above sea level, Hill 123 in the center, the dominant feature, approximately 123 feet high, and a smaller unnamed knoll to the north, about 60 feet high. If the Japanese came overland from the south through the jungle, this ridge was the natural highway to Henderson Field. It was the gateway. Thomas persuaded a reluctant Vandergrift to move forces onto the ridge. Vandergrift initially believed the main Japanese attack would come along the coast and resisted relocating his thin forces inland. Thomas cleverly framed the move as sending the battered Raiders and Paramarines to a rest area, away from the coastal shelling. On the morning of September 10, Edson marched his men onto the ridge. He told them with a thin, knowing smile, "Too much bombing and shelling here, too close to the beach. We are moving to a quiet spot." Nobody believed him. They knew Red Mike too well. A quiet spot, in Edson's vocabulary, meant a place where the fighting would be worst. By September 11, 840 Marines were deployed along the ridge. Edson's raiders held the western approaches, between the ridge spine and the Lunga River. The remnants of the 1st Marine Parachute Battalion, the legendary Paramarines, held the eastern side. The Paramarines had been savage during the initial landings on Gavutu and Tanambogo on August 7th. Of the roughly 400 who had fought there, they had suffered over 50% casualties. By mid-September, the battalion was a skeleton of its former self, with only about 86 men remaining. They were exhausted, understrength, and many were shaking with malaria. But they were still Marines, and they were still willing to fight. Edson placed his command post on Hill 123, the central and highest point of the ridge. From there, looking south, he could see the kunai grass swaying in the breeze, the dark wall of jungle beyond it, and the gentle saddle of ground connecting his position to Hill 80. To the north, behind him, the ground sloped down toward the flat coastal plain where Henderson Field's runways stretched between rows of damaged palm trees. The distance from Hill 123 to the fighter strip was barely 1,000 yards. That was the margin. 1,000 yards of coral and grass between the Japanese and the prize they had come to take. He dug in his heavy weapons company, Company E, distributing machine gun teams across the most critical positions along the ridge. He coordinated closely with Colonel Pedro Del Valle, commanding the 11th Marines Artillery Regiment. Del Valle, a Puerto Rican-born officer the men called Don Pedro, spent September 12 repositioning his guns and meticulously pre-registering targets along the southern approaches to the ridge. Battery after battery adjusted fire, marking coordinates, calculating ranges. When the Japanese came, the artillery would be ready. Del Valle also placed a forward observer directly at Edson's command post on Hill 123, ensuring that artillery fire could be called in with maximum speed and precision. The first blow fell on the night of September 12. At 21:30 hours, the Japanese light cruiser Sendai and 3 destroyers shelled the marine perimeter for 20 minutes, a searchlight sweeping ominously across the ridge from offshore. Light Japanese artillery joined the bombardment, though it did little physical damage. Then, out of the jungle to the south, Major Yukichi Kokusho's 1st Battalion of the 124th Regiment launched a premature, disorganized attack against Raider Company C, positioned between the Lunga River and the western edge of the ridge. In the darkness and confusion, Kokusho's men overran at least one platoon and forced Company C back onto the ridge proper. But the assault was poorly coordinated. Kokusho's troops became entangled in the dense vegetation with Lieutenant Colonel Kusukichi Watanabe's 3rd Battalion, which was still groping forward through the jungle to its jump-off position. The resulting confusion ended the attack for the night. On the flanks, Colonel Oka's Western Group and the Kuma Battalion to the east both failed to make contact with the marine perimeter and halted before dawn. At first light, on September 13, Marine aircraft from the Cactus Air Force and Del Valle's artillery hammered the areas south of the ridge, catching Japanese troops in the open and killing several, including 2 officers from Watanabe's battalion. A 2-company Marine counterattack attempted to recover the ground, lost during the night, but failed to make headway in the thick jungle. Edson then made the single most important tactical decision of the battle. Instead of trying to hold the entire length of the ridge with his thin force, he deliberately shortened and tightened his defensive line. He pulled his men back approximately 400 yards to a compact, horseshoe-shaped position centered on Hill 123. 5 companies were concentrated around and behind the hill in mutually supporting positions. Any Japanese force that captured Hill 80 to the south would now have to cross 400 yards of open, fire-swept ground to reach the marine line. It was a calculated gamble. Surrender ground to concentrate firepower. It went against every aggressive instinct in Edson's body. But it was the right call, and he knew it. That afternoon, in the humid, oppressive heat of a tropical September, Edson stood on a grenade box in front of his exhausted men and spoke. He was soft-spoken as always, his voice barely carrying above the wind rustling through the kunai grass. "You men have done a great job, and I have just one more thing to ask of you. Hold out just one more night. I know we have been without sleep a long time, but I expect another attack tonight, and I think they will come at us with everything they have got. If we hold, I have every reason to believe we will be relieved tomorrow morning." He paused and looked at them. these gaunt, yellow-skinned, hollow-eyed men standing in their rotting dungarees on a ridge in the middle of nowhere. Many were shaking with malaria chills, even in the tropical heat. Most had dysentery so bad they could barely stand for 10 minutes without needing to find a slit trench. All were hungry. They were down to 1 or 2 grenades per man. Their foxholes were shallow scrapes in the coral because they had no engineering equipment, and the coral was too hard to dig deeply with entrenching tools. Their uniforms were disintegrating in the tropical humidity, held together in places with strips of Japanese cloth scavenged from captured supplies. They had not slept properly in days. Some had not slept at all in 48 hours. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Nobody looked away from the small, red-haired colonel standing on a grenade box. That silence was their answer. They would hold for 1 more night, or they would die on this hill. There was nothing else to discuss. As darkness fell on the evening of September 13, 830 Marines faced approximately 3,000 Japanese troops across a moonless, tropical night. The conditions could not have been worse for the defenders. Total darkness, so thick a man could not see his own hand in front of his face. Dense jungle pressing in on 3 sides. An enemy force approaching with nearly 4-to-1 numerical superiority and the determination to break through or die trying. Edson's men had no reserves. No reinforcements were coming until morning, if morning ever came. At 2100 hours, 7 Japanese destroyers briefly shelled the ridge. The bombardment was short but violent, sending men diving for cover and filling the air with smoke and dust. Then the shelling stopped. Silence returned. For a few minutes, the only sounds were the ringing in men's ears and the distant crash of surf. Then, from the southern jungle, the screaming began again. Kokusho's battalion struck first on the western flank, pouring out of the tree line and slamming into Raider Company B. The assault was ferocious. Japanese soldiers charged up the slope, screaming, firing rifles from the hip, hurling grenades, some wielding bayonets and swords. The muzzle flashes in the darkness created a strobe effect, freezing moments of combat in snapshots of light and shadow. Company B fought hard but was forced back toward Hill 123 under overwhelming pressure. Some of Kokusho's troops bypassed the Marine flanks entirely, pushing through swampy ground east of the Lunga River, heading straight for Henderson Field. These Japanese soldiers stumbled upon a Marine ration dump in the darkness and stopped. They had not eaten properly in days, their own supplies having been destroyed at Tasimboko. They gorged themselves on American C and K rations. That pause, born of desperate hunger, cost them precious time and momentum. It may have saved the airfield. Simultaneously, Major Masao Tamura's 2nd Battalion of the 4th Regiment smashed into the junction between the Raiders and the Paramarines in the center of the line. The impact was devastating. The seam between the 2 units buckled. Raider Company B was briefly isolated. Parachute Companies B and C were forced back. In the chaos of close-quarters night fighting, with muzzle flashes the only illumination and screaming, dying men everywhere. Some Marines began shouting, "Withdraw." A partial panic rippled along parts of the line. Men who had been fighting without sleep for days, who were sick and starving and terrified, began to break. This was the moment. This was the razor's edge on which the entire Guadalcanal campaign balanced. This was when Merritt Edson earned his place in history. He walked the line. He did not run. He did not crawl. He walked, standing fully upright, moving from foxhole to foxhole along the crest of Hill 123, roughly 20 yards behind the firing line, completely exposed to the storm of bullets, grenades, and mortar fragments pouring up the slope from every direction. He grabbed men by their shoulders, turned them around, and pointed them back toward the enemy. His voice, that quiet Vermont voice that men had to lean in to hear, cut through the chaos like a blade. Raiders, parachuters, engineers, artillerymen, I do not give a damn who you are. You are all Marines. Come up on this hill and fight. 2 bullets passed through his shirt that night. Neither one touched his skin. He never flinched. He never ducked. He simply walked the line, over and over, his presence alone holding the position together when training and discipline and courage were no longer enough. Captain Houston Stiff, a Raider officer the men knew as Tex, watching from a nearby position, said afterward that if there is such a thing as one man holding a battalion together, Edson did it that night. He stood just behind the front lines, stood when most of us hugged the ground. Around midnight, During a brief, fragile lull in the fighting, Edson ordered the parachute companies to fix bayonets and counterattack. Captain Harry Torgerson, commanding one of the parachute companies, led the charge personally, calling his Paramarines by name in the darkness, driving them back up the eastern slope of Hill 123 with fixed steel. They retook the critical ground on the eastern shoulder of the hill in hand-to-hand combat, bayonet against bayonet, in pitch blackness, so complete that men identified friend from foe by touch and by voice. On the western side, Major Kenneth Bailey, commanding Company C of the 1st Raider Battalion, fought through the worst of it. Bailey had already suffered a severe head wound but refused evacuation. For more than 10 hours straight, he ran ammunition and grenades through enemy fire to the men holding Hill 123. He personally led counterattack after counterattack. He dragged wounded men to cover. He fought hand-to-hand with bayonet, pistol, and rifle butt. He was everywhere on that hill, bleeding from the head, staggering with exhaustion, refusing to stop. Behind the ridge, the 11th Marines Artillery under Colonel Del Valle fired throughout the night with devastating effect. The forward observer at Edson's command post called down fire so close to friendly positions that the 105mm shells were landing within 200 yards of Marine foxholes. The concussion waves from friendly fire rolled across the hill, shaking the dirt loose from the walls of foxholes and rattling teeth, but the shells were landing among the Japanese assault waves and tearing them apart. The forward observer's call that night became legendary. Drop it 5-0 and walk it back and forth across the ridge. That night alone, the artillery fired 1,992 rounds of 105mm ammunition and more than 1,000 rounds of 75mm. Japanese survivors would later speak with genuine awe of what they described as the Americans' automatic artillery, unable to comprehend how conventional guns could fire so fast and so accurately. On Hill 80, Tamura's men dragged a 75mm regimental gun into a direct fire position aimed at Hill 123. If that gun had fired, it would have poured high-explosive shells directly into the Marine command post at point-blank range. But when the crew pulled the trigger, nothing happened. The firing pin was defective. The gun never fired. A mechanical failure worth a fraction of a penny, a tiny piece of hardened steel that failed to strike true, may have saved the position and the airfield behind it. Such are the margins on which history turns. At 0200 hours, the Japanese attacked again, preceded by a mortar barrage that churned the hilltop into a landscape of craters and broken coral. Japanese soldiers surged up the slopes in waves, climbing over their own dead. They were thrown back by rifle fire, machine gun bursts, grenades thrown at arm's length, and bayonets at ranges so close that men could feel each other's breath. Machine gunners fought until their ammunition ran dry, then scrambled across the ridge, searching for more rounds, dragging belts from the dead to feed their guns. When the guns fell silent one by one, men picked up rifles, pistols, anything they could find, and kept fighting. At 0230, Edson radioed General Vandergrift at the division command post. His message, as recorded by those who were there, was simple: "We can hold." At 0400 hours, 2 more Japanese pushes were broken against the Marine line. Troops from the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, moved forward to reinforce the ridge. Edson fed them into the line as they arrived, plugging gaps, steadying the defense. 3 Japanese companies, roughly 300 men, actually skirted the ridge defenses entirely and reached the edge of Henderson Field's fighter strip. Engineers, artillerymen, cooks, and headquarters clerks grabbed their rifles and fought a desperate close-range battle to keep the Japanese off the runway. The enemy was that close. A few hundred yards from the airstrip, that was the reason for everything. Around 0530, the last Japanese pressure finally broke. About 100 Japanese soldiers remained pinned on the southern slope of Hill 80, caught in the open as the eastern sky began to lighten. At first light, on September 14, 3 Bell P-400 Airacobras of the United States Army's 67th Fighter Squadron roared off Henderson Field's runway. The flight was led by Captain John Thompson, with First Lieutenants Brian Brown and B.E. Davis on his wings. The P-400 was an export variant of the P-39, originally built for the British, who rejected it, then shipped to Guadalcanal because no other theatre wanted them. They were nearly useless as high-altitude fighters. But at treetop level, armed with a 20mm Hispano cannon in the nose and 30 and 50 caliber machine guns in the wings. They were devastating ground attack platforms. Thompson's flight made repeated low-level strafing runs across the exposed Japanese positions on Hill 80. The 20mm cannon shells tore through men and equipment. The effect was catastrophic. Most of the remaining Japanese on the slope were killed. The survivors broke and disappeared into the jungle. Brown's P-400 was hit so badly that he lost power and had to glide back, landing deadstick on the fighter strip. Thompson took hits to his radiator and made an emergency landing before the engine seized. Davis kept strafing until his ammunition was exhausted and landed without damage. General Vandergrift found Captain Thompson afterward and told him quietly, "You will not read about this in the newspapers, but you and your flight of P-400s just saved Guadalcanal." Then he slipped a bottle of scotch into Thompson's pocket. Thompson received the Navy Cross, one of only 11 awarded to Army Air Forces personnel during the entire war. Brown and Davis each received the Silver Star. When the morning sun rose fully over the ridge on September 14, the ground told the story in a language that needed no translation. Japanese dead lay in heaps on the slopes, in the kunai grass, draped over strands of barbed wire, crumpled in the foxholes they had briefly overrun. Marines counted roughly 500 bodies on and around the ridge. 200 of them lay on the slopes of Hill 123 alone. Total Japanese losses across the 3 days of fighting were between 700 and 850 killed, with hundreds more wounded who would die in the terrible retreat that followed. Marine losses were severe for so small a force. Approximately 80 Marines were killed in action on the ridge. More than 100 were wounded. Edson's combined Raider and Parachute force suffered 256 total casualties from the Tasimboko raid through the end of the Ridge battle. About 1 in 5 of the men who fought on the night of September 13 to 14 became casualties. Major Kenneth Bailey survived the Ridge. He was recommended for the Medal of Honor for his 10 hours of continuous combat with a head wound on Hill 123. But 12 days later, on September 26, 1942, Bailey was killed in action, leading his company at the Matanikau River. He was 31 years old. His Medal of Honor was awarded posthumously, presented to his widow at the White House by President Franklin Roosevelt on March 24, 1943. The Japanese retreat from the ridge was a march through hell. Major General Kawaguchi led the shattered remnants of his brigade into the jungle on the morning of September 16. They had eaten their last rations 2 days earlier. As the survivors staggered westward through trackless, mountainous jungle toward the Japanese positions at Kokumbona near the Matanikau River, men weakened rapidly. First, they discarded their heavy equipment, then their packs, then their rifles. By the time the main body reached Kokumbona 5 agonizing days later, only half the men still carried weapons. The Kuma Battalion's survivors became completely lost, wandering the jungle for 3 weeks, nearly starving to death before they stumbled into Japanese lines more dead than alive. A Japanese officer's diary, captured later by the Marines, recorded the horror. He wrote that he could not keep from crying when he saw those men marching without food for 4 or 5 days, carrying the wounded through the curving and sloping mountain trails. The wounds could not receive adequate treatment. There was not a single wound without maggots. Many died on the trail and were left where they fell. The jungle, which had been their ally during the approach, now became their enemy. Men collapsed from hunger, dehydration, and untreated wounds. Officers who had led their companies forward with confidence now struggled to keep the survivors moving. Equipment, weapons, and even the dead were abandoned along the trail. The force that had marched south with such determination to destroy the Marine airfield returned to its own lines as a shattered, barely coherent mob. The consequences of Edson's stand rippled outward from that ridge in ways that no one on the ground could have foreseen. On September 15, 1942, Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, at the Japanese headquarters in Rabaul, learned of Kawaguchi's defeat. It was the Imperial Japanese Army's first significant ground defeat of the Pacific War. The shock traveled all the way to Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. Facing a collapsing supply situation on the Kokoda track in New Guinea, and now an unfolding crisis on Guadalcanal, Hyakutake, with authorization from Tokyo, ordered the withdrawal of Japanese troops that had been advancing toward Port Moresby. Those forces had pushed to within 30 miles of the last major Allied base in New Guinea. They never resumed that offensive. The ridge on Guadalcanal had not been the only factor, but it had been the trigger that confirmed Japan's emergency. An entire front, 1,000 miles away, was abandoned. 3 days after the battle, on September 18, a United States Navy convoy delivered the 7th Marine Regiment, over 4,000 fresh troops, to Guadalcanal. Vandegrift finally had the men to close his defensive perimeter. The campaign continued for nearly 5 more months, through the horrific naval bombardment of October, the battle for Henderson Field in late October, the naval battle of Guadalcanal in November, until the final Japanese evacuation on February 9, 1943. But the moment when the entire enterprise nearly collapsed, the night the enemy came closest to victory on the ground, had passed on Edson's Ridge. General Vandegrift later acknowledged that Kawaguchi's assault was the only time during the entire Guadalcanal campaign when he seriously doubted the outcome. On May 21, 1943, at Balcombe, Australia, Major General Vandegrift personally presented the Medal of Honor to 3 men of the 1st Marine Division, Colonel Merritt Edson, 2nd Lieutenant Mitchell Page, and Platoon Sergeant John Basilone. Page and Basilone received theirs for heroism during the later October battles for Henderson Field. Edson's citation praised him for personally directing the defense of the reserve position against a fanatical foe of greatly superior numbers, enabling his men to cling tenaciously to their position on the vital ridge. Edson went on to command the 5th Marines through the Matanikau fighting. He served as Chief of Staff of the 2nd Marine Division at Tarawa. He was Assistant Division Commander at Saipan and Tinian. He retired as a Major General on August 1, 1947, leaving the Corps in protest over provisions in the National Security Act that he believed threatened Marine Corps independence. After his military career, he became the first Commissioner of the Vermont Department of Public Safety, founding the Vermont State Police, served as Executive Director of the National Rifle Association, and worked on the Defense Advisory Committee on Prisoner of War Problems that helped draft the Military Code of Conduct. On August 14, 1955, Merritt Austin Edson was found dead in his garage in Washington, D.C., at the age of 58, from carbon monoxide poisoning. The death was ruled a suicide. His family disputed the finding. No autopsy was performed. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, Section 2, Grave 4960, with the full honors of a grateful nation. Today, at the Marine Corps Recruit Depot in San Diego, every new Marine finishes the final training exercise called the Crucible by climbing a hill known as the Reaper. Mounted at the summit, the last thing those exhausted recruits read before they earn the title Marine is Edson's Medal of Honor citation. Edson's Ridge was not the largest battle of the Pacific War. It did not involve the greatest number of troops. It did not produce the heaviest casualties. But it may have been the single most consequential night of ground combat in the entire Pacific theater. If those 830 Marines had broken, Henderson Field would have fallen. Without the airfield, the Cactus Air Force could not operate. Without air cover, the Marine perimeter was indefensible. Without Guadalcanal, the Allied road to Tokyo never opens. All of it rested on a narrow coral ridge in the darkness, and on one quiet colonel from Vermont who stood upright when every instinct in his body told him to get down, who walked when others crawled, who looked at 800 starving, shaking, exhausted Marines and asked them for just one more night, and who, when the command post radioed asking if he could hold, sent back 3 words that changed the course of a war. "We can hold.